the golden glow of St. Mary's Literary Festival, where poets weave dreams and rivalries burn, a scream shatters the autumn air. Leonard Ashby, a celebrated poet, lies dead, strangled by a rose-embroidered scarf, his final words whispering of betrayal. Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and keen eyes, unravels a tangled web of ambition, envy, and obsession. A ruthless publisher, a venomous critic, a devoted fan, and a jealous rival. Each hides a secret. Each could be a killer. As clues unfold in verses and shadows, only Miss Marple can stitch together the truth before the festival's final curtain falls. Chapter 1. The Festival of Words. The village of St. Mary's, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, wore its autumn finery with an air of quiet pride. The elms lining the green blazed crimson and gold, and a brisk October breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now in its 10th year, had transformed the sleepy hamlet into a hive of activity. White canvas tents dotted the green like oversized mushrooms, their interiors stuffed with books, pamphlets, and the hum of eager voices. Scholars, poets, and avid readers milled about, their conversations a tapestry of earnest debate and self-conscious wit. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a cushioned folding chair near the tea tent, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive acuity. Her nephew, Raymond West, had insisted she attend, claiming the festival would be just the thing to amuse her. Raymond, a writer of middling success whose novels leaned heavily on psychological flourish, had secured her a guest pass, and Miss Marple, ever indulgent of her nephew's enthusiasms, had agreed to come. She wore a plain tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a sensible hat. Her knitting, a soft gray shawl, lay across her lap, the needles clicking rhythmically as she watched the crowd. "Really, Raymond," she had said that morning over breakfast at his rented cottage, "I'm not sure modern poetry is quite my cup of tea. So much of it seems to lack structure." Her mild tone belied the sharpness of her mind, which Raymond, for all his literary pretensions, often underestimated. "Oh, Aunt Jane," he'd replied with a grin, "you'll find plenty to observe. These festivals are less about the words and more about the egos. You'll be in your element." Now, as she sat with a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside her, Miss Marple conceded he had a point. The festival was a microcosm of human nature. Ambition, envy, and admiration swirled together like leaves in the wind. A young woman in a bohemian shawl clutched a dog-eared poetry collection, her eyes darting worshipfully toward a nearby tent. A bespectacled man, likely a critic, scribbled furiously in a notebook, his lips pursed in disapproval. And there, striding past with a confident air, was a poet. Roland Finch, she recalled Raymond mentioning, whose dramatic gestures suggested a man eager to be noticed. The festival's centerpiece that evening was a reading by Leonard Ashby, a poet whose recent collection, Wounds of the Muse, had stirred both adoration and controversy. Raymond had described him as a comet in the literary sky, though Miss Marple suspected this was less about Ashby's talent and more about his knack for publicity. Still, she settled into her seat in the main tent, her knitting tucked into her bag, curious to see what the fuss was about. The tent was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ashby took the stage, a lean figure in a black turtleneck, his dark hair falling artfully over one eye. His voice, low and resonant, filled the space as he read, each poem a jagged shard of emotion, grief, love, betrayal, woven with startling imagery. The audience was spellbound, some leaning forward, others clutching their programs as if to anchor themselves. Miss Marple, though unmoved by the verse's modernity, noted the passion in Ashby's delivery and the way certain faces in the crowd, some adoring, others resentful, betrayed more than polite interest. As the final poem drew to a close, the applause was thunderous. Ashby bowed slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips, and retreated to his private tent for a scheduled signing. The crowd dispersed, buzzing with commentary. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes catching a flash of movement near Ashby's tent. A woman in a rose-embroidered scarf, a man with a hurried gait, a shadow that might have been nothing at all. She reached for her knitting, her fingers moving mechanically as her mind sifted through these fragments. Then came the scream. It was sharp, almost animal, cutting through the festival's hum. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and a young woman. Miss Marple recognized her as Evelyn Carter, an ardent fan, stumbled from Ashby's tent, her face ashen. "He's dead," she cried, her voice breaking. "Mr. Ashby, he's dead." The crowd surged forward, but Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needles still. A murmur of shock rippled through the green, and within minutes the local constable, Inspector Craddock, arrived, his face set in a familiar blend of determination and exasperation. He cordoned off the tent and began barking orders to his men. Miss Marple, unnoticed by most, rose quietly and approached the scene, her small figure slipping past the gawkers with the ease of someone accustomed to being overlooked. "Dear me," she murmured, peering toward the tent's entrance, where Craddock's silhouette was visible against the canvas. A poet of all people. One wonders what words could inspire such violence. She did not enter. There was no need yet, but her eyes, bright and unyielding, took in every detail. The curious onlookers, the nervous gestures of a woman she later learned was Clara Henshaw, Ashby's publisher, and the way Roland Finch lingered at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen such scenes before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond, and she knew that beneath the festival's polished veneer lay a tangle of motives as intricate as her knitting. As she returned to her seat, Raymond hurried over, his face flushed with excitement. "Aunt Jane, can you believe it? Murder at a literary festival. It's like something out of one of my novels." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "People, Raymond," she said softly, "are much the same, whether in a village or a tent full of poets. And murder, I'm afraid, is never quite as novel as you think." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, so vibrant mere moments ago, now lay under a pall of shock. The scream that had shattered the evening's revelry still echoed in the minds of those gathered on the village green. Tents, once bright with the promise of literary discourse, seemed to sag in the gathering dusk, their canvas walls trembling in the October breeze. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan drawn tightly against the chill, stood at the edge of the cordoned-off area, her small figure almost invisible among the murmuring onlookers. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, but her hands were still, her eyes fixed on the tent where Leonard Ashby, the poet whose words had captivated so many, had met his end. Inspector Dermot Craddock, a man whose brisk efficiency belied a certain weariness with human folly, emerged from the tent, his notebook clutched tightly. He was no stranger to Miss Marple, having crossed paths with her in St. Mary Mead on more than one occasion. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, settling briefly on her familiar form before he turned to address his constable. "Keep them back, Harris," he said sharply, "and fetch Dr. Haydock. We'll need his report." Miss Marple, with the unobtrusive grace of a village spinster, edged closer to the tense entrance, her movements so natural that no one thought to question her presence. She had no intention of interfering, not yet, but her curiosity, honed by years of observing the small dramas of St. Mary Mead, compelled her to see what she could. The tent flap was partially open, revealing a scene that was both stark and strangely poetic. Leonard Ashby sat slumped in a wooden chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his dark hair falling across his pale forehead. Around his neck, knotted with deliberate precision, was a silk scarf, its delicate rose embroidery a jarring contrast to the grimness of its purpose. The desk before him was strewn with papers, poems, notes, a fountain pen lying uncapped as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. A glass of red wine, half empty, stood beside a crumpled piece of paper, its ink smudged but legible. The muse is silent. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A poet's death," she murmured to herself, "is never without its flourishes." She noted the absence of any sign of struggle. No overturned chairs, no scattered books, no marks on Ashby's hands to suggest he had fought his attacker. The scene was too tidy, too composed, as if the killer had known exactly how to approach their victim. Her eyes lingered on the scarf, its intricate pattern catching the dim light of the tense lantern. It was not the sort of thing a man like Ashby would wear, nor did it seem to belong to the utilitarian furnishings of the festival tent. A woman's scarf, she thought, or perhaps one chosen to seem so. Craddock, re-entering the tent, caught sight of her and sighed, though there was a flicker of respect in his expression. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a blend of exasperation and resignation. "I might have known you'd be here. I suppose Raymond dragged you to this literary circus?" "Indeed, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild, but her eyes bright. "Though I confess, I find the human spectacle far more compelling than the poetry. A terrible business, this." "Terrible and puzzling," Craddock admitted, glancing at Ashby's body. "No signs of a fight, no obvious clues beyond that scarf and the note. Dr. Haydock will confirm the cause of death, but it's clear enough. Strangulation. The scarf was pulled tight, and whoever did it had the strength to finish the job quickly." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the glass of wine. "Quickly, yes," she said softly, "but not impulsively, I think. A poet's muse may be silent, but this killer was anything but careless. That scarf, Inspector, do you know where it came from?" Craddock frowned, following her gaze. "Not yet. It's distinctive, though. We'll ask around. Could belong to one of the women at the festival, or someone who wanted it to look that way." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing the weather. "And the wine? Had Mr. Ashby been drinking before he was interrupted?" "We'll have it tested," Craddock said, making a note. "Though it's likely just festival fare. They've been serving it all evening." He paused, studying her. "You've got that look, Miss Marple. What are you thinking?" She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the handle of her knitting bag. "Only that murder, like a good poem, often hides its meaning in plain sight. The scarf, the note, the wine, They're all part of the verse, aren't they? We need only to read it correctly. Craddock suppressed a smile, accustomed to her cryptic insights. Well, I'll stick to facts for now. We've got 4 people who were seen near this tent before the scream. Clara Henshaw, his publisher, Martin Quayle, a critic who didn't much care for Ashby, Evelyn Carter, a young woman who followed him like a shadow, and Roland Finch, another poet with a chip on his shoulder. Any of them could have done it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through these names, each a thread in the tapestry of the crime. A publisher, a critic, a fan, and a rival, she mused. A cast as varied as any village drama. I dare say you'll find their motives are as tangled as that scarf. Dr. Haydock arrived, a stout man with a brisk manner, and set to work examining the body. Miss Marple stepped back, allowing the professionals their space, but her eyes continued to roam the tent. She noted the open notebook on the desk, its pages filled with Ashby's spidery handwriting. A single line caught her attention. The shadow covets what it cannot claim. It was unfinished, the pen trailing off as if the poet had been distracted, or worse. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock later. Outside, the crowd had grown, their whispers forming a low hum of speculation. Raymond West pushed through, his face alight with a mix of horror and fascination. "Aunt Jane," he called, hurrying to her side. "This is dreadful. Ashby, of all people, strangled. It's like something out of a Greek tragedy." "Or a village scandal," Miss Marple replied, her tone dry. "Tragedy, Raymond, is often just human nature dressed in finer words. Tell me, what do you know of these suspects the inspector mentioned?" Raymond, ever eager to play the raconteur, launched into a detailed account. Clara Henshaw, he said, was a formidable woman in her 40s, the head of Ashby's publishing house, Henshaw and Sons. She had staked much of her firm's reputation on Ashby's success, but there were rumors of financial strain and disagreements over his next book. "She was seen arguing with him this morning," Raymond confided. "Something about royalties. Clara's not one to suffer fools, and Ashby could be difficult." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring an image of Mrs. Bantry's cousin, who had once run a small press in Chipping Cleghorn and was forever fretting over authors' demands. "Ambition can make one ruthless," she remarked, "but murder requires a different kind of nerve." Then there was Martin Quayle, a critic whose venomous reviews had made him a feared figure in literary circles. He called Ashby's work a pastiche of stolen sentiments, Raymond said, clearly relishing the phrase. They had a public spat at last year's festival, and Quayle was near the tent this evening, looking smug. "A critic's pride is a fragile thing," Miss Marple observed. "I once knew a man in St. Mary Mead who wrote for the parish newsletter. He took every slight as a mortal wound. But to kill over a review, that would be excessive." Evelyn Carter, the fan, was a different matter. Raymond described her as a pale, intense young woman who had followed Ashby to every reading, her copy of Wounds of the Muse worn from constant handling. "She's devoted," Raymond said, "but there's something unsettling about her. She was crying near his tent earlier, clutching a poem she'd written for him." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Devotion can be a dangerous thing. Raymond, I recall young Elsie, our vicar's niece, who fancied herself in love with a visiting curate. Her passion led to all sorts of mischief, though thankfully not murder. Finally, there was Roland Finch, a poet whose star had waned as Ashby's rose. Finch is all bluster," Raymond said. "He fancies himself the next Keats, but His work's been overshadowed. I heard him at the pub last night saying he'd show Ashby up soon. He's got a temper, too. Envy, Miss Marple said softly, is a motive as old as Cain, but it takes a certain coldness to act on it. She glanced toward the tent where Dr. Haydock was now speaking to Craddock. "What does the doctor say, Inspector?" she called, her voice carrying just far enough. Craddock approached, his expression grim. "Strangulation, as expected. No other injuries, no signs of a struggle. Ashby was likely caught off guard. Haydock estimates the time of death at around 8 o'clock, shortly after his reading ended. The scarf did the job, tightly knotted, no hesitation." "And the wine?" Miss Marple prompted. "Sent to the lab," Craddock replied, "though it'll take time to get results. The note, though, that's curious. The muse is silent. Could be Ashby's own words or the killer's taunt." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or both," she said. "Poets are fond of their own phrases, but a killer might choose them to mislead. Have you looked at his notebook, Inspector? There's a line about a shadow and something unclaimed. It may mean nothing, but—" Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting it down. "You don't miss much, do you? I'll have a look. For now, we're questioning the 4 we know were nearby. Henshaw, Quayle, Carter, and Finch. They all had reason to dislike Ashby, and none have a solid alibi yet." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving connections. The scarf, she thought, was the key. Its delicate embroidery suggested a deliberate choice, perhaps to implicate someone like Clara or Evelyn, both of whom were known to favor such accessories. But Roland Finch's ambition gnawed at her thoughts, as did Martin Quayle's bitter resentment. And Evelyn's devotion, could it have turned to rage? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's unrequited love had led to vandalism, not murder. But the line between passion and violence was thin. As Craddock returned to the tent, Raymond tugged at her sleeve. "Aunt Jane, you're not getting involved, are you? This is Craddock's job, not yours." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with that familiar spark. "Oh, Raymond, I'm merely an observer. But I find that murder, like a poorly darned sock, often unravels if you tug at the right thread. And this scarf, I think, is a very fine thread indeed." The crowd began to disperse, ushered away by the constables, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the green. The festival lights flickered, casting long shadows across the grass, and she felt a familiar stirring, a sense that beneath the surface of this literary haven lay a story far darker than any poem Ashby had ever penned. She adjusted her cardigan and picked up her knitting bag, her mind already turning to the suspects, their motives, and the quiet malice that had silenced a poet's voice forever. Chapter 3. The Suspects Emerge. The morning after Leonard Ashby's murder dawned gray and damp, the St. Mary's Literary Festival cloaked in a mist that seemed to mirror the unease settling over its attendees. The village green, so lively the previous evening, now felt subdued, the white tents sagging under the weight of dew and whispered speculation. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table outside the festival's tea tent, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her gray shawl. Her nephew, Raymond, ever restless, had gone to fetch her a fresh pot of tea, leaving her to observe the comings and goings of the crowd with her characteristic quiet intensity. Inspector Craddock had wasted no time in organizing his investigation. By mid-morning, he had set up a makeshift headquarters in the festival office, a cramped room behind the main stage, its walls lined with posters advertising past literary events. Miss Marple, invited to join him for a brief consultation, Craddock had learned to value her insights, however reluctantly, made her way there, her sensible shoes silent on the damp grass. She carried her knitting bag, its contents a comforting weight, and her eyes missed nothing. The nervous glance of a bookseller, the hushed argument between two volunteers, the way a young woman in a heavy coat lingered near Ashby's tent, now cordoned off with police tape. Inside the office, Craddock stood over a cluttered desk, his notebook open to a page scrawled with names and timelines. 4 suspects, Miss Marple, he said, rubbing his temples. Each with a motive, each seen near the tent before that scream. But no one saw the act itself, and the alibis are flimsier than tissue paper. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "Dear me, Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "Motives are like weeds in a garden, plentiful, but not all are poisonous. Tell me about these 4. Craddock sighed, flipping through his notes. "First, there's Clara Henshaw, Ashby's publisher. A sharp woman runs Henshaw and Sons. She had a row with him yesterday morning over money, royalties, advances, something like that. Witnesses say she was furious, and that scarf we found. Well, it's awfully like one she was wearing earlier." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "A publisher's fortunes are tied to their authors, Inspector. I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Price, who ran a small printing shop. She'd do anything to keep her best clients happy, but cross her, and she could be quite formidable. Still, murder is a drastic step for a businesswoman." "Perhaps," Craddock conceded. "Next is Martin Quayle, the critic. He's got a reputation for tearing into anyone who's got a bit of fame. Called Ashby's work pretentious tripe in a review last month. They had a public spat at a reading in London, and Quayle was seen lurking near the tent last night, looking pleased with himself." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Critics, Inspector, are rather like our village schoolmaster, Mr. Jenkins, who could never resist pointing out a flaw in anyone's work. It made him feel important. But to kill over a bad review? That requires a particular kind of bitterness." "Then there's Evelyn Carter," Craddock continued, his tone softening slightly. "Young, barely 20, follows Ashby everywhere. She's got a whole scrapbook of his poems, some with notes he wrote to her. She was near the tent, crying, just before the murder. Claims she just wanted to give him a poem she'd written. But she's intense. And she had a scarf like the one used, though she swears she didn't wear it yesterday." "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes softening. "She reminds me of young Lily, who worked at the post office in St. Mary Mead. She fell terribly in love with a traveling salesman, wrote him letters full of poetry. When he ignored her, she broke every plate in her mother's kitchen. Passion can be destructive, but murder is another matter." Craddock nodded, moving to the last name. "And Roland Finch, the rival poet. He's been struggling to make a name for himself, while Ashby's been stealing the spotlight. Finch was heard boasting he'd outdo Ashby, and he was seen near the tent, though he claims he was just strolling. He's got no alibi, and he's got a temper." "Envy is a cruel master," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking again. "I recall Mr. Thomas, our village grocer, who was forever jealous of the new shop in Chipping Cleghorn. He never did more than grumble, but a poet's pride is a different thing. It burns hotter." Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "That's the lot. Henshaw, Quayle, Carter, Finch. All had reason to want Ashby gone. All were nearby, and none can prove where they were at 8 o'clock sharp. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes drifting to the window, where the mist curled around the tents like a living thing. "And the scarf, Inspector? Have you learned anything more about it?" "We're checking," Craddock said. "It's silk, hand-embroidered with roses, not common, but not rare either. Clara Henshaw admitted it's like one she owns, though she says hers went missing yesterday afternoon. Evelyn Carter has one too, but she claims it was in her bag all day. We're still asking around." "A scarf is such a personal thing," Miss Marple mused. "In St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Bantry once lost a lace shawl at a church fete. It turned up in the vicar's study. Of all places, but not before half the village was whispering about theft. A scarf like this one. It feels deliberate, don't you think? As if someone meant it to be noticed." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting it was planted to point us at someone?" "I suggest nothing, Inspector," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. "I only wonder. People are so careless with their belongings, but killers are rarely careless with their clues." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Constable Harris poked his head in, his face flushed. "Sir, we've got something. One of the volunteers found a pen near the tent. Ashby's, by the look of it. It's got his initials, and it's not the one on his desk." Craddock's eyes lit up. "Where was it?" "Just outside, half buried in the grass," Harris said. "Could have been dropped in a hurry." Miss Marple's needles slowed. "A pen," she said softly. "How curious. A poet's tool, left behind like a breadcrumb. Perhaps it fell from the killer's hand, or was left to lead us somewhere." Craddock shot her a look, half amused, half exasperated. "You're full of theories today, Miss Marple. I'll have it bagged and checked for prints. For now, I'm bringing in the suspects for a proper talk. Care to sit in? You might catch something I miss." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of intruding," she said, but her smile suggested she had no intention of staying away. "I'll just sit quietly if I may. People do say the most interesting things when they think no one's listening." The interviews began shortly after, in a small tent repurposed for the purpose. Clara Henshaw was first, her tall frame filling the space with an air of authority. Her auburn hair was swept into a neat chignon, and her tailored coat spoke of success, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of strain. "This is a tragedy," she said, her voice crisp. "Leonard was our brightest star. His death is a blow to the firm, and to literature." Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "You argued with him yesterday, Mrs. Henshaw. Care to explain?" Clara's lips tightened. "A business matter. He wanted a larger advance for his next collection, which was ambitious, given our current finances. I told him we'd discuss it after the festival. It was heated, yes, but I didn't kill him." "And the scarf?" Craddock pressed. "You were seen wearing one like it." "It's mine, or was," she admitted, her composure faltering. "I left it in the festival office during lunch. When I went back, it was gone. Anyone could have taken it." Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, noted the quick recovery in Clara's tone, the way her hands smoothed her skirt as if to steady herself. A businesswoman's pride, she thought, is not unlike Mrs. Harmon's when her cakes failed at the village fete. But theft of a scarf? That's a bold move for a killer. Next came Martin Quayle, a wiry man with sharp features and a perpetual sneer. His tweed jacket was frayed at the cuffs, suggesting a man who lived for words rather than wealth. Ashby was a fraud, he said bluntly. His poems were stitched together from better poets, ones he never credited. I called him out and he didn't like it. You were seen near his tent, Craddock said. What were you doing there? Looking for a confrontation, Quayle admitted, unapologetic. I wanted to challenge him on his latest work, but he was alive when I left, sulking over his wine. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. A critic's ego, she thought, is like Mr. Pye's in St. Mary Mead, always needing to be the cleverest in the room. But would he risk his reputation for murder? Evelyn Carter followed, her pale face streaked with tears. She clutched a worn copy of Ashby's book, her fingers trembling. He was everything, she whispered. His poems, they spoke to me. I just wanted to give him my poem, to show him I understood. And the scarf? Craddock asked gently. It's mine, she said, her voice breaking. But I didn't wear it yesterday. It was in my bag. Someone must have taken it. Miss Marple watched Evelyn's trembling hands, her heart aching. Like poor Mary, who loved the curate too fiercely, she thought. But love doesn't always lead to violence. Finally, Roland Finch entered, his broad shoulders and theatrical air filling the tent. His dark eyes flashed with defiance. I didn't like Ashby, he said. He stole the spotlight, but I'd beat him with my work, not my hands. I was walking the grounds when it happened. No one saw you, Craddock pointed out. Finch shrugged. Poets wander. It's what we do. Miss Marple noted the ink stains on his fingers, the restless energy in his posture. Like young Tommy, who envied his brother's success, she thought. Envy can fester, but does it strangle? As the interviews ended, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Well, any insights? She smiled, folding her knitting. Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector. The scarf, the pen, the motives, they're all pieces of a puzzle. But puzzles, like village gossip, only make sense when you see the whole picture. Craddock grunted, but his eyes held a spark of respect. As Miss Marple stepped back into the mist, her mind was already turning, sorting the threads of this literary tragedy into a pattern only she could yet discern. Chapter 4. The Publisher's Ambition. The mist that had cloaked St. Mary's Literary Festival in the early morning had lifted by noon, revealing a sky of pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. The village green, though quieter than the previous day, still hummed with the determined cheer of those who refuse to let murder dampen their literary zeal. Tents fluttered gently in the breeze, and the scent of fresh-baked scones mingled with the musty aroma of old books. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more at her favored table outside the tea-tent, sipped a cup of Darjeeling, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. Her gray shawl was growing longer, its neat stitches a contrast to the tangled motives she was beginning to unravel. Inspector Craddock had scheduled further interviews with the suspects, and Miss Marple, at his begrudging invitation, had agreed to observe. She had no official role, of course, but Craddock had come to appreciate the way her quiet presence seemed to coax truths from even the most guarded tongues. Her nephew, Raymond, meanwhile, had taken to trailing her like an eager puppy, his writer's imagination alight with the drama of the case. It's like one of my novels, Aunt Jane, he said, settling beside her with a plate of biscuits. A publisher with secrets, a poet with a grudge, pure fiction come to life. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Fiction, Raymond. is often just truth with a better wardrobe, but real secrets are rarely so tidy. Her eyes drifted toward the festival office, where Clara Henshaw was due to face Craddock again. The publisher had intrigued Miss Marple from the moment she saw her, a woman of poise and calculation, whose every gesture seemed designed to command respect. Yet there was something in her polished exterior that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Eldridge, a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who could charm a customer while quietly tallying their debts. The interview took place in the same cramped tent as the previous day, its canvas walls now warmed by slanting sunlight. Clara Henshaw entered with the confidence of a general, her auburn hair gleaming, her tailored navy dress accentuating her tall frame. She carried a leather portfolio, as if prepared for a board meeting rather than a murder inquiry. Craddock stood at the desk, his notebook open, while Miss Marple sat in a corner, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the tension in the air. "Mrs. Henshaw," Craddock began, his tone firm but polite, "we need to revisit your movements yesterday evening. You were seen near Mr. Ashby's tent before the reading, and again shortly before the scream. Can you clarify what you were doing?" Clara's eyes, cool and gray, met his without flinching. "I've told you, Inspector. I spoke to Leonard after his reading to discuss a publicity schedule for his next book. It was brief. He was in one of his moods, distracted, scribbling in that notebook of his. I left him to it and went to check on the festival's accounts in the office." "And the argument you had with him earlier?" Craddock pressed. "Witnesses say it was quite heated." Clara's lips tightened, but her voice remained steady. "A professional disagreement, nothing more. Leonard was demanding a larger advance than we could afford. His last book sold well, but the firm is stretched thin. I told him we'd need to see the new manuscript first. He took it badly, but that's hardly a motive for murder." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes resting on Clara's hands, which gripped the portfolio a shade too tightly. Like Mrs. Eldridge, she thought, when she was caught overcharging for flour. All smiles, but her hands gave her away. Aloud, she said nothing, letting Craddock continue. "The scarf, Mrs. Henshaw," he said, producing a photograph of the murder weapon, its rose embroidery vivid against the silk. "You said it's like one you own, but it went missing. Can you be more specific about when and where you last saw it?" Clara's composure flickered, a brief shadow crossing her face. "I wore it yesterday morning, during the festival's opening. It's a favorite of mine. Handmade, from a boutique in London. I left it draped over a chair in the office when I went to lunch. When I returned, it was gone. I assumed one of the volunteers had misplaced it." "Convenient," Craddock said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "And you didn't see anyone take it?" "No," Clara replied, her voice crisp. "The office was busy, volunteers, authors, staff coming and going. Anyone could have picked it up." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over Clara's words. The publisher's story was plausible, but its very neatness troubled her. In St. Mary Mead, when Mrs. Bantry's pearl brooch went missing at a garden party, it was found in the pocket of a guest who swore she'd borrowed it for safekeeping. Theft, Miss Marple knew, was often a cover for something darker. A scarf is such an intimate choice for a murder weapon, she thought. Either Mrs. Henshaw is telling the truth, or someone meant to make us doubt her. Craddock leaned forward, his pen tapping the desk. "Mrs. Henshaw, your firm stood to lose a great deal if Ashby walked away. His success was keeping Henshaw and Sons afloat, wasn't it? A desperate publisher might take drastic steps. Clara's eyes flashed, but her voice remained controlled. Desperate? Hardly. Leonard was valuable, yes, but not irreplaceable. I've other authors, other projects. Killing him would have been cutting off my own hand. Besides, Inspector, do I strike you as the sort to strangle a man in a fit of pique? Craddock didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the faintest flush on Clara's cheeks, the way her fingers tightened on the portfolio. She's proud, Miss Marple thought, like Mrs. Price, who ran that printing shop. She'd never admit to weakness, but money troubles can make even the proudest bend. As Clara was dismissed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "She's cool as ice," he said, "but that scarf bothers me. If it's hers, why use it to kill Ashby? It's too obvious." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, her needles clicking. "Or perhaps it's meant to seem obvious. In St. Mary Mead, when young Tommy stole a pie from Mrs. Baker's windowsill, he left a trail of crumbs to the vicar's shed, hoping we'd blame the vicar's boy. The scarf could be someone's crumbs, Inspector." Craddock grunted, jotting a note. "You're saying someone framed her? That's a bold move." "Murder is bold," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "And killers, like poets, often fancy themselves cleverer than they are." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Raymond burst into the tent, his face alight with gossip. "Aunt Jane, Inspector, you'll never believe what I heard at the bookstall. One of the vendors saw Clara talking to Roland Finch near the office yesterday, right around the time she says her scarf went missing. They looked conspiratorial." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Conspiratorial how?" "Oh, you know," Raymond said, waving a hand. "Heads close together, whispering, glancing about like they didn't want to be seen. The vendor thought it was odd, given Finch's rivalry with Ashby." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. "How interesting," she said. "Mr. Finch, with his poet's pride, and Mrs. Henshaw, with her publisher's ambition. I wonder what they had to whisper about." Craddock made a note to question Finch again, but Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere. She recalled a moment from the previous evening, just before Ashby's reading, when she'd seen Clara adjusting her scarf near the festival office. It had caught the light, its roses vivid against the silk. Had someone been watching, waiting for a chance to take it? Or was Clara's story of theft a convenient fiction, designed to deflect suspicion? As they left the tent, Miss Marple paused to survey the green. The festival was resuming its schedule, with poets reading to smaller, more subdued crowds. She spotted Clara speaking to a group of authors, her smile as polished as ever, but her eyes darting toward the police tape around Ashby's tent. She's worried, Miss Marple thought, but not panicked. A woman like that plans her moves carefully. Raymond, trailing behind, couldn't resist another comment. "It's practically Shakespearean, Aunt Jane. A publisher driven to murder by greed, a poet's life snuffed out for profit. It's a plot twist even I couldn't dream up." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes still on Clara. "Greed is a powerful motive, Raymond, but so is pride. And I suspect Mrs. Henshaw's pride is as great as her ambition. Whether it led her to murder, though, that remains to be seen." She tucked her knitting into her bag and started toward the tea tent, her mind weaving together the threads of Clara's story, the stolen scarf, and the whispered meeting with Roland Finch. The festival, with its air of cultured refinement, was proving to be as fraught with secrets as any village, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a well-crafted verse, would reveal itself only to those who read between the lines. Chapter 5. The Critic's Venom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the St. Mary's Literary Festival, its golden light doing little to dispel the chill that lingered after Leonard Ashby's murder. The village green, though still dotted with readers and poets, felt subdued, as if the very air held its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual spot by the tea tent, her knitting needles weaving their steady pattern, a gray shawl growing beneath her deft fingers. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, followed the movements of the festival-goers, noting the way whispers spread like ripples on a pond. Her nephew, Raymond, ever the enthusiast for drama, had wandered off to eavesdrop on the latest gossip, leaving her to ponder the threads of the case in peace. Inspector Craddock had summoned Martin Quayle, the critic whose barbed reviews had made him a figure of dread among the festival's literary set, for a second interview. Miss Marple, at Craddock's invitation, joined him in the small canvas tent used for questioning, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. The tent was sparsely furnished, a folding table, a few chairs, and a lantern casting a soft glow on the canvas walls. Craddock stood with his notebook open, his expression one of determined patience, while Miss Marple settled in a corner, her knitting a quiet hum beneath the conversation. Martin Quayle entered with a swagger that belied his slight frame. His tweed jacket, worn at the elbows, and his sharp, fox-like features gave him the air of a man who relished his own cleverness. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to pierce rather than observe, flicked toward Miss Marple before settling on Craddock. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying a trace of mockery, "I trust you've called me here to confirm my innocence, not to waste my time with more questions." Craddock's lips twitched, but his tone remained even. "Mr. Quayle, you were seen near Mr. Ashby's tent just before his death. You've admitted to a confrontation with him. I'd like you to walk me through your movements again, and this time, let's have the details." Quayle sighed, as if the request were beneath him, and leaned back in his chair. "Very well. I went to Ashby's tent after his reading, around 7:30. I wanted to challenge him on his latest drivel, those poems he called Wounds of the Muse. They're a patchwork of stolen ideas, you know, from poets far better than he ever was. I told him as much. He bristled, of course, but he was alive and sulking when I left." "And what time was that?" Craddock asked, his pen poised. Quayle shrugged, his fingers drumming on the table. 10 minutes to 8, perhaps. I didn't linger. I went to the main tent to listen to the next reading, but it was dull, so I stepped outside for a cigarette. "Anyone see you?" Craddock pressed. Quayle's sneer widened. "The festival was crawling with people, Inspector. I'm sure someone saw me, but I don't keep a diary of my admirers. I was alone by the oak tree near the bookstalls when I heard the scream." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on Quayle's hands, which moved with a restless energy. Like Mr. Pye, she thought, who used to lecture at the St. Mary Mead Women's Institute, always so sure of his own brilliance, but his hands betrayed his nerves when challenged. Aloud, she said nothing, letting Craddock steer the conversation. "The scarf, Mr. Quayle," Craddock said, sliding a photograph of the rose-embroidered silk across the table. "Recognize it?" Quayle glanced at it, his sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. "Vaguely. I've seen Clara Henshaw wear something like it, and that girl Evelyn Carter had one too. It's not mine, if that's what you're implying. I prefer wool, less ostentatious." "And you never touched it?" Craddock asked, his eyes narrowing. "Never," Quayle said firmly. "I'm a critic, not a thief. If I wanted to ruin Ashby, I'd do it with words, not silk." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Quayle's dismissive tone. Words can wound as deeply as any weapon, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead incident where a cruel letter had driven poor Miss Hartnell to tears. But to kill over a literary feud? That requires a grudge sharper than a pen. Craddock leaned forward, his voice steady. "You called Ashby a fraud, Mr. Quayle. You accused him of plagiarism in print. That's a serious charge for a poet, one that could ruin him. Did he threaten to retaliate? A lawsuit, perhaps?" Quayle's laugh was sharp, like broken glass. "A lawsuit? Ashby hadn't the spine for it. He shouted, called me a hack, but he knew I was right. His work was derivative, cobbled together from obscure poets like Haverford and Lyle. I was exposing him, Inspector, not killing him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes softening as if she were merely curious. "Dear me, Mr. Quayle," she said, her voice gentle. "You must have studied Mr. Ashby's work very closely to make such claims. It sounds almost personal." Quayle's eyes flicked to her, a spark of irritation in their depths. "Personal? Hardly. It's my job to separate the wheat from the chaff. Ashby was chaff, and I said so. If that made him enemies, that's his fault, not mine." Craddock made a note, his expression unreadable. "You were seen near the festival office earlier yesterday, around the time Mrs. Henshaw says her scarf went missing. Care to explain?" Quayle's fingers stilled, his sneer replaced by a cautious frown. "I was dropping off a review for the festival newsletter. The office was a madhouse, papers everywhere, volunteers tripping over each other. I didn't see any scarf, and I certainly didn't take one." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind sifting through Quayle's words. Like Mr. Jenkins, she thought, who always had an answer for everything, even when his accounts didn't add up. A critic's pride is a dangerous thing, but is it deadly? She noted the way Quayle's eyes darted toward the photograph of the scarf, as if it held some significance he wasn't admitting. Craddock pressed on. "Your review of Ashby's work caused a stir, Mr. Quayle. Some say it threatened his career. A man like that, cornered, might fight back. Did he have anything on you? Something to make you want him silenced?" Quayle's face hardened, his voice cold. "If you're suggesting I killed him to protect my reputation, you're barking up the wrong tree. My reviews stand on their own. Ashby was a flash in the pan, and I said so. If someone strangled him, look to his sycophants or his rivals, not me." As Quayle was dismissed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "He's slippery," he said. "All that bluster, but he's hiding something. That pause when he saw the scarf, it wasn't just surprise." Miss Marple nodded, folding her knitting carefully. "A critic's weapon is his words, Inspector, but words can mask as much as they reveal. Mr. Quayle strikes me as a man who enjoys his power, but power can breed enemies. I wonder if he knew more about Mr. Ashby than he lets on." Craddock grunted, flipping through his notebook. "We've got a witness who saw him near the office, and another who says he was arguing with someone, not Ashby, near the bookstalls before the murder. Could be nothing, but I'll dig deeper." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "In St. Mary Mead, when Mr. Pye argued with the butcher over a bad cut of meat, it wasn't the meat that mattered, but what he said about the butcher's wife. It's the small things, Inspector, that tell the story. As they stepped out of the tent, Raymond appeared, his face flushed with excitement. "Aunt Jane, I've got something. The bookseller near the oak tree says Quayle was there last night, but not smoking. He was reading a letter, and he looked furious. Burned it right after, too." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A letter? How curious. Like the one Miss Hartnell received, full of spiteful words. I wonder what Mr. Quayle's letter said, and who sent it." Craddock made a note to check for ashes near the oak tree, though he doubted they'd find anything intact. Miss Marple, meanwhile, gazed across the green, where Quayle was now speaking to a small group of festival-goers, his gestures animated, his sneer firmly in place. "He's a performer," she thought, "but performers often hide their true selves. What did Mr. Ashby know that made Mr. Quayle so angry?" She tucked her knitting into her bag and started toward the tea tent, her mind weaving together Quayle's sharp words, the burned letter, and the rose-embroidered scarf. The festival, with its veneer of culture, was proving to be a stage for darker passions, and Miss Marple knew that the critic's venom, like a poorly hidden stitch, might yet unravel the truth. Chapter 6. The Fan's Devotion. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now in its second day, carried on with a forced air of normalcy, as if the shadow of Leonard Ashby's murder could be dispelled by the rustle of turning pages and the murmur of poetry readings. The village green, bathed in the soft light of a late afternoon sun, seemed almost serene, its tents glowing like lanterns against the fading blue sky. Yet the undercurrent of unease was palpable, woven into the glances of festival-goers and the hushed tones of their conversations. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more at her table by the tea tent, sipped a fresh cup of chamomile, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision. The gray shawl in her lap was nearing completion, its neat rows a testament to her patience, a quality she found equally useful in untangling human motives. Inspector Craddock had arranged to question Evelyn Carter, the young woman whose fervent admiration for Ashby had marked her as a suspect, and Miss Marple, as ever, had been invited to observe. Her nephew, Raymond, still buzzing with the thrill of the investigation, hovered nearby, his notebook filled with scribbled theories. "She's an odd one, Aunt Jane," he said, leaning close. "Evelyn, I mean. Always clutching that book of Ashby's, muttering his poems like prayers. It's unsettling." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "Devotion, Raymond, can be a powerful thing. I recall young Elsie in St. Mary Mead, who followed the curate about with such fervor that she quite forgot herself. But love, even misguided, doesn't always lead to murder." She adjusted her lavender cardigan and rose, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, as they made their way to the interview tent. The tent was as sparse as before, its canvas walls now tinged with the golden hue of the setting sun. Craddock stood by the folding table, his notebook open, his face a mask of professional calm. Miss Marple settled into her corner, her needles resuming their soft rhythm, a sound so familiar it went unnoticed by most. Evelyn Carter entered hesitantly, her slight frame almost swallowed by a heavy wool coat far too warm for the weather. Her pale face was streaked with the remnants of tears, and her dark eyes, wide and haunted, clutched a worn copy of Wounds of the Muse as if it were a lifeline. Her hair, a tangle of brown curls, fell loosely about her shoulders, and her hands trembled as she sat. "Miss Carter," Craddock began, his tone gentler than with the others. "I need you to tell me again about your movements last night. You were seen near Mr. Ashby's tent before the scream. What were you doing there?" Evelyn's fingers tightened on the book, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to see him, to give him something. A poem I wrote, inspired by his work. He understood everything. His words, they were like mine, but better. I thought he'd want to read it." Craddock's eyes softened, but his questions remained pointed. "You didn't go inside the tent?" She shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, I couldn't. I stood outside, waiting for him to finish signing books. I saw him through the flap, writing in his notebook. He looked sad. I didn't want to bother him, so I stayed outside, reading his poems again." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze fixed on Evelyn's trembling hands. Like Lily, who wrote those letters to the salesman, she thought. So earnest, so fragile. But fragility can hide a surprising strength. She noted the way Evelyn's eyes darted to the photograph of the rose-embroidered scarf when Craddock placed it on the table. "This scarf, Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady. "You have one like it, don't you?" Evelyn's breath caught, her fingers clutching the book tighter. "Yes, but I didn't wear it yesterday. It's in my bag, at my lodgings. I swear I didn't. I couldn't hurt him. I loved him." Her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "His poems, they saved me. When I felt alone, they were there. How could I take that away?" Craddock leaned forward, his tone measured. "Love can turn to anger, Miss Carter. Did Mr. Ashby ever reject you? Ignore your poem, perhaps, or dismiss your feelings?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, he was kind. He wrote notes in my book, little messages. He said my poems had promise. He saw me, Inspector, when no one else did." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Evelyn's words. Kindness, she thought, can be misinterpreted, just as it was with Miss Hartnell's niece, who mistook the vicar's politeness for affection. A young woman's heart is a delicate thing. Aloud, she said softly, "Miss Carter, those notes in your book, may we see them? They might help us understand Mr. Ashby's state of mind." Evelyn hesitated, then opened the book, revealing pages marked with Ashby's handwriting, brief encouragements like, "Keep writing," and "You have a spark." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes scanning the words. They were generous but impersonal, the sort of thing a teacher might write to a promising student. He was careful, she thought, not to lead her on, but she saw what she wanted to see. Craddock took the book, flipping through it carefully. "These are dated over several months," he said. "You followed him to other readings, didn't you?" Evelyn nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I went to everyone I could. London, Bath, Oxford. His words, they were my world. I'd never hurt him, Inspector. Never." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "But you were upset last night, crying outside his tent. Why?" Evelyn's voice trembled. I heard him talking to someone. A man, I think. They were arguing, quietly, but it sounded angry. I thought maybe he was in trouble, but I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, holding my poem, until I heard the scream." Miss Marple's needles stilled completely, her attention sharpening. A man, she thought. Not Clara, then, but perhaps Quayle or Finch, or someone else entirely. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about other men seen near the tent. Craddock pressed further. Did you recognize the voice, or see who it was? Evelyn shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. It was too low, and the tent flap was closed. I only heard bits, something about taking what's mine. Then it stopped, and I waited. But then the scream came. Craddock made a note, his expression unreadable. "And your scarf, Miss Carter. You're certain it was in your bag all day?" "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I checked this morning. It's still there. Someone must have taken one like it to make it look like I did it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained sharp. Poor child, she thought, so lost in her devotion, like young Mary with her curate. But devotion can blind, and blinds can hide many things. She noted the way Evelyn's hands shook, not just with grief, but with a nervous energy that suggested fear or guilt. As Evelyn was dismissed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "She's a mess," he said, "but I don't know if it's guilt or just obsession. That story about an argument, it's the first we've heard of it. Could be Finch or Quayle, or someone we haven't considered." Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully, her eyes thoughtful. "She's fragile, Inspector, but fragility can be deceptive. In St. Mary Mead, when Elsie broke those plates, it wasn't just anger. It was fear of being seen for what she was. Miss Carter's love for Mr. Ashby is real, but what she heard, or what she did, that's the question." Craddock nodded, jotting down a note to check for witnesses to the argument Evelyn described. "We'll search her lodgings for that scarf," he said. "If it's there, it might clear her. If not—" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A scarf is such a small thing, Inspector, but so telling. Like the handkerchief Mrs. Bantry found in her garden, used to frame poor Mr. Hodge. I wonder if Miss Carter's scarf is as innocent as she claims." As they stepped out of the tent, Raymond was waiting, his eyes wide with excitement. "Aunt Jane, I heard something at the tea tent. One of the volunteers saw Evelyn near the festival office yesterday, around the time Clara's scarf went missing. She was carrying a bag, and she looked sneaky." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sneaky, Raymond? Like young Tommy when he pinched apples from Mrs. Baker's orchard, but appearances can deceive. We must see that scarf for ourselves." She glanced across the green, where Evelyn was retreating to a bench, her book clutched to her chest. The girl's grief was genuine, but Miss Marple knew that grief could mask darker truths. The argument Evelyn overheard, the scarf, the notes in her book, they were all threads in a tapestry that was still taking shape. As she returned to her table, her knitting bag swinging gently, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of intuition. The festival, with its poetry and passion, was a stage for human weakness, and Evelyn Carter's devotion, like a fragile stitch, might yet unravel the heart of this crime. Chapter 7. The Rival's Envy. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now in the waning hours of its second day, carried a strange duality, part defiance, part unease. The village green, bathed in the amber glow of late afternoon, buzzed with the determined chatter of poets and readers. Yet the cordoned-off tent, where Leonard Ashby had met his end, cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced at her usual table by the tea tent, sipped a cup of Earl Grey, her knitting needles moving with the quiet precision of a metronome. The gray shawl in her lap was nearly finished, its orderly stitches a stark contrast to the tangled motives she was piecing together. Her nephew, Raymond, ever eager for intrigue, had wandered off to glean more gossip from the festival stalls, leaving her to reflect on the suspects and their secrets. Inspector Craddock had arranged to question Roland Finch, the rival poet whose envy of Ashby's success marked him as a prime suspect. Miss Marple, invited once again to observe, made her way to the small canvas tent used for interviews, her sensible shoes leaving faint impressions in the dew-damp grass. The tent's interior was unchanged, spare, with a folding table, a few chairs, and a lantern casting flickering shadows on the canvas. Craddock stood by the table, his notebook open, his expression a blend of determination and fatigue. Miss Marple settled into her corner, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the tension that hung in the air like mist. Roland Finch entered with a theatrical flourish, his broad shoulders filling the tent's entrance. His dark hair was swept back, his eyes burning with a restless intensity that seemed to seek an audience. He wore a velvet jacket, slightly rumpled, and his fingers, stained with ink, twitched as if longing for a pen. "Inspector," he said, his voice rich with a poet's cadence, "I hope this won't take long. I've a reading to prepare for, and my work, unlike Ashby's, deserves an audience." Craddock's eyebrow rose, but his tone remained steady. "Mr. Finch, you were seen near Mr. Ashby's tent before his death. You've admitted to envying his success. I need you to account for your movements between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Last night." Finch leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Envy? I'd call it professional rivalry. Ashby had a knack for publicity, I'll give him that, but his work was shallow. I was near his tent, yes, chatting with some festival-goers after his reading. I didn't go inside. By 8, I was wandering the grounds, soaking in the atmosphere. A poet needs inspiration, Inspector." "No one can confirm that," Craddock said, his pen poised. "You were heard boasting you'd outdo Ashby. Care to explain?" Finch's smile widened, but his eyes were cold. "Words, Inspector. I meant I'd outshine him with my next collection. My poems have depth, soul, qualities Ashby's lacked. I didn't need to kill him to prove it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze fixed on Finch's ink-stained fingers. Like young Tommy in St. Mary Mead, she thought, who envied his brother's cricket trophies and bragged he'd do better. But Tommy's boasts hid a deeper resentment, and Mr. Finch's hands tell a story of their own. She noted the way his fingers fidgeted, as if eager to write, or to conceal. Craddock slid a photograph of the rose-embroidered scarf across the table. "This scarf, Mr. Finch. It was used to strangle Mr. Ashby. Mrs. Henshaw and Miss Carter own similar ones, but it was found in Ashby's tent. Ever seen it before?" Finch glanced at the photograph, his expression unreadable. "Pretty thing," he said. "I've seen Clara Henshaw wear one like it, and that girl Evelyn had one too. Not my style, though. I prefer plain wool, less likely to be noticed." "And you didn't see it in the festival office yesterday?" Craddock asked, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Henshaw says hers went missing around lunchtime, when you were seen nearby." Finch's smile faltered, his fingers stilling. "I was in the office, dropping off a manuscript for the festival's poetry contest. It was chaos, papers, people, no one paying attention. If a scarf went missing, I didn't see it. I had no reason to take it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Finch's words. Chaos is a convenient cloak, she thought, like when Mr. Hodge's tools went missing during the village fete. Someone always benefits from disorder. Aloud, she said gently, "Mr. Finch, you seem very certain of your talent. It must have been galling to see Mr. Ashby's star rise while yours—" lingered. Finch's eyes flashed, but his voice remained smooth. Galling? Perhaps, but I'm patient. Miss Marple, is it? Ashby's fame was a fluke, a bubble waiting to burst. I didn't need to kill him to prove my worth. Craddock leaned forward, his tone sharp. You were seen, whispering with Mrs. Henshaw near the office yesterday, around the time her scarf vanished. What were you discussing? Finch's composure flickered, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Business, he said curtly. Clara was considering my next collection for publication. We were negotiating terms, nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp. Like Mr. Thomas, the grocer, who once tried to undercut his rival with a secret deal, she thought. But Mr. Thomas's deals were never quite as innocent as he claimed. She noted the faint flush on Finch's cheeks, the way his fingers resumed their restless twitching. Craddock made a note, his expression skeptical. And after this business talk, you went straight to the grounds? No one saw you until the scream. Finch shrugged, his smile returning but less certain. As I said, I was wandering. Poets don't punch clocks, Inspector. I was near the bookstalls, then the oak tree, then... Well, I heard the scream like everyone else. Craddock's eyes narrowed. A witness says you were seen with a bottle of wine earlier that day, though you didn't drink it yourself. Care to explain? Finch's smile vanished, his fingers clenching. Wine? I might have carried a bottle for a volunteer. Festival duties, you know. I don't recall specifics. I'm not much for drinking when I'm working. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts racing. Wine, she thought, like the brandy Mr. Pye offered at the parish meeting, claiming it was for hospitality. But Mr. Pye's brandy had a purpose, and I wonder if Mr. Finch's wine did too. She recalled Craddock's mention of a sedative in Ashby's glass, a detail not yet public. Could Finch have slipped something into the wine? As Finch was dismissed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. He's cocky, he said, but nervous underneath. That wine business, he didn't expect us to know about it, and his alibi's as thin as paper. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. Envy is a powerful spur, Inspector, but it's the quiet ones who surprise you. Mr. Finch's bravado reminds me of young Tommy, who swore he'd outdo his brother but never dared act on it. Yet Mr. Finch's hands, they're restless, like they've held more than a pen. Craddock grunted, flipping through his notebook. We're checking the wine bottle for prints, and I'll have Harris question the volunteers about Finch's movements. That meeting with Henshaw bothers me too. If they were plotting something, it could tie to the scarf. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving together the threads of Finch's story. In St. Mary Mead, when Mr. Thomas's rival lost his best customer, it wasn't chance. It was a whispered deal gone wrong. I wonder what Mr. Finch and Mrs. Henshaw were really discussing. As they stepped out of the tent, Raymond appeared, his face alight with fresh gossip. Aunt Jane, you'll never guess. A vendor saw Finch near Ashby's tent before the reading, not after. He was carrying something, a notebook, maybe, or a bottle. The vendor couldn't be sure, but he looked furtive. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Furtive, she said softly, like young Tommy when he hid his brother's cricket bat. Small acts of spite can lead to larger ones, Raymond. She glanced across the green, where Finch was now pacing near a bookstall, his velvet jacket catching the fading light. His restless energy, his ink-stained fingers, his whispered meeting with Clara, They were all pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She tucked her knitting into her bag and started toward the tea tent, her mind turning over the rival poet's boasts and the wine that might have dulled Ashby's senses. The festival, with its air of cultured rivalry, was a stage for ambition and envy, and Miss Marple knew that Roland Finch's performance, like a poorly crafted verse, might yet reveal the flaw that would unravel the truth. Chapter 8. The Clue in the Verse. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now approaching the close of its second day, seemed to teeter on the edge of its own resilience. The village green, bathed in the soft twilight of an autumn evening, retained a fragile charm, with lanterns casting warm pools of light across the tents. Yet the murmur of poetry readings and the clink of teacups could not fully mask the tension that lingered after Leonard Ashby's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her familiar table by the tea tent, sipped a cup of chamomile, her knitting needles weaving the final rows of her gray shawl. Her eyes, sharp and serene, followed the ebb and flow of the crowd, noting the nervous glances and hushed whispers that betrayed the festival's unease. Her nephew, Raymond, ever eager for a tale, had wandered off to charm a bookseller for more gossip, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. Inspector Craddock, his patience fraying under the weight of an elusive case, had invited Miss Marple to join him in examining Ashby's belongings, particularly his notebook, which had been found open on the desk in the murder tent. The small canvas tent used for interviews was now doubling as a temporary evidence room, its interior cluttered with sealed bags and a single table where Craddock spread out the poet's effects. Miss Marple entered quietly, her lavender cardigan a soft contrast to the starkness of the scene. She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, and watched as Craddock opened the notebook, its pages filled with Ashby's spidery script. "This caught your eye yesterday, Miss Marple," Craddock said, his voice tinged with curiosity. "That line about a shadow and something unclaimed. I've had a look, and there's more here. Poems, fragments, notes. Might be nothing, but you seem to think otherwise." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on the notebook. "Poets, Inspector, are like gossips in St. Mary Mead. They say more than they mean to, if you know how to listen. Mr. Ashby's words may hold a truth he didn't intend to share." Craddock turned to the final page, where Ashby's last entry was scrawled in hasty ink. "The rival's shadow looms, but my light burns brighter." The words were jagged, as if written under duress, and the pen had trailed off, leaving a faint smear. Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "A rival's shadow," she murmured. "It's rather pointed, don't you think? Like Mrs. Bantry's diary, when she wrote about that meddling neighbor before her roses were trampled. The shadow, I suspect, is Mr. Finch." Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. "Finch has the motive, envy, plain and simple, and he was seen near the tent carrying something suspicious. But this note alone isn't enough to pin him. There's more here. Look." He flipped to an earlier page, where another fragment caught the eye. "The muse weeps for stolen words, but the thief will pay." The ink was steadier, dated 2 days before the murder. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. "Stolen words," she said softly. "That sounds like Mr. Quayle's accusation of plagiarism. Or perhaps Mr. Ashby felt someone else was claiming his work. Poets are such sensitive creatures, Inspector, like young Tommy in St. Mary Mead, who wept when his brother took credit for his model boat." Craddock grunted, flipping through more pages. "There's a lot of this. Cryptic lines, half-finished verses, but nothing names a killer outright. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A poem, like a village rumor, often hides its truth in metaphor. Mr. Ashby was troubled, I think, by more than just fame. These words suggest betrayal, rivalry, perhaps even fear. We must look closer at those around him. Their conversation was interrupted by Constable Harris, who entered with a sealed evidence bag. "Sir, the lab results on the wine glass came back. There was a sedative in it, mild, but enough to make Ashby drowsy, slow his reflexes. No prints, though, except his own." Craddock's eyes lit up, though his voice remained steady. "A sedative. That explains why there was no struggle. Whoever killed him wanted him docile. Finch was seen with a bottle of wine, and Evelyn mentioned an argument. Could be connected." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts weaving together the new information. A sedative, she thought, like the sleeping draught Mrs. Eldridge slipped into her husband's tea when she wanted a quiet evening. But this was no domestic spat. It was calculated. Aloud, she said, "The wine, Inspector, is most telling. Someone ensured Mr. Ashby couldn't fight back. And the scarf, its roses are too deliberate, don't you think, as if chosen to point us somewhere?" Craddock nodded, his mind clearly racing. The scarf could implicate Clara or Evelyn, but Finch had access to the office where Clara's went missing, and that whisper with Clara. Maybe they were planning more than a book deal. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Or perhaps the scarf was meant to mislead, like the handkerchief Mr. Hodge found in his shed, planted to make him look guilty. We mustn't assume too quickly, Inspector. Craddock turned back to the notebook, flipping to a page marked with a date from the previous week. A single line stood out. "The muse is silent when the heart betrays." It echoed the crumpled note found beside Ashby's body. "The muse is silent." And Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The same phrase," she said softly. "But here, it's about betrayal, not death. I wonder if Mr. Ashby felt betrayed by someone close, a friend, a lover, a rival." Craddock made a note, his expression grim. "Could be any of them. Clara for money, Quayle for pride, Evelyn for love, Finch for fame. But this rival's shadow keeps pointing to Finch." Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a St. Mary Mead memory. When young Tommy's brother took his place in the choir, Tommy wrote a bitter little rhyme about it. It didn't name names, but everyone knew who he meant. Mr. Ashby's verses are the same. They accuse without accusing. As they pored over the notebook, Raymond burst into the tent, his face flushed with excitement. "Aunt Jane, Inspector, you won't believe this. A volunteer just told me they saw Finch near the wine stall yesterday, asking for a specific bottle. Red, same as what was in Ashby's glass. Said he was doing a favor for someone." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "A favor? That's what he said about the bottle he was carrying. We need to press him on this." He turned to Miss Marple. "What do you think? Is Finch our man?" Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "Envy is a cruel motive, Inspector, but it's the quiet details that matter. The wine, the scarf, the verse, they're all part of the same poem. Mr. Finch's ambition burns bright, but whether it led him to murder, we need more than shadows, to be sure." Craddock grunted, closing the notebook. "I'll have Harris check the wine stall and re-interview Finch, and we'll keep digging into this notebook. If Ashby was hinting at his killer, we'll find it." Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag swinging gently. "In St. Mary Mead, When Mrs. Bantry's roses were ruined, it wasn't the obvious culprit who held the shears. It was the quiet one, the one no one noticed. We must look beyond the obvious, Inspector. As they stepped out into the twilight, the festival's lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across the green. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Roland Finch, who was now reciting a poem to a small crowd, his voice rich with passion. His ink-stained fingers gestured dramatically, but his eyes, she noted, darted toward the police tape around Ashby's tent. A poet's heart, she thought, is a dangerous thing when it burns with envy. She returned to her table, her mind turning over the verses, the sedative, and the scarf's delicate roses. The festival, with its air of literary fervor, was a tapestry of ambition and betrayal, and Miss Marple knew that Ashby's final words, like a hidden stitch, held the key to unraveling the truth. Chapter 9. The Festival's Secrets. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now in the early hours of its third day, clung to its schedule with a tenacity that bordered on defiance. The village green, kissed by a pale morning sun, sparkled with dew, and the tents stood crisp against a sky streaked with delicate clouds. Yet the air held a brittleness, as if the festival's veneer of literary cheer could crack under the weight of Leonard Ashby's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her customary table by the tea tent, sipped a cup of Darjeeling, her knitting needles weaving the final touches of her gray shawl. The festival's hum, poets reciting, readers browsing, volunteers bustling, provided a backdrop to her thoughts, which turned ceaselessly on the case's tangled threads. Her nephew Raymond, ever eager for intrigue, had wandered off to charm a bookseller, leaving her to observe the crowd with her quiet, unerring gaze. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to resolve, had invited Miss Marple to join him in reviewing new evidence. The small canvas tent used for interviews was now a hub of activity, with constables sorting through witness statements and evidence bags. Miss Marple entered, her lavender cardigan a soft contrast to the tent's utilitarian starkness, and settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. Craddock stood by the folding table, a stack of papers before him, his notebook open to a page dense with notes. "We've got a few new pieces, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and determination. The wine stall confirmed Finch was there, asking for a specific bottle of red, same vintage as the one in Ashby's glass. No prints on the bottle, though, and the sedatives common enough. Could have come from anywhere. And then there's this. He slid a small evidence bag across the table, containing a charred scrap of paper. Found near the oak tree, where Quayle was seen burning something. It's too damaged to read, but it's got traces of ink, maybe from a letter. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on the scorched fragment. "A letter burned in haste," she murmured. "Like the note Mrs. Hartnell found in her garden, half destroyed to hide a secret. I wonder what Mr. Quayle was so eager to conceal." Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. "We're still checking Evelyn's scarf. She swears it's at her lodgings, and Harris is searching now. But I keep coming back to Finch. That wine, his meeting with Clara, the rival's shadow. In Ashby's notebook. It all points to him." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Envy is a powerful spur, Inspector, but it's the small things that tell the story. In St. Mary Mead, when Mr. Thomas's rival lost his best customer, it was a quiet whisper that did the damage, not a shout. We must look beyond the obvious." Their conversation was interrupted by Constable Harris, who entered with a flushed face. "Sir, we found Evelyn's scarf in her room, just like she said. Same pattern as the murder weapon, but clean. No blood, no fibers. Looks like she's telling the truth." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "So either she's innocent, or she's clever enough to have a spare. What about the office? Any leads on who took Clara's scarf?" Harris shook his head. "It's a mess, sir. Volunteers say the place was chaos during lunch. Anyone could have slipped in. But one of them saw Finch lingering near Clara's desk, looking at her things. Didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over this new detail. Lingering, she thought, like young Tommy when he eyed Mrs. Baker's apples. Small acts of opportunity can lead to greater crimes. Aloud, she said, "Mr. Finch seems to have been many places, Inspector. Near the wine stall, the office, the tent. A restless soul, perhaps, or one with a purpose." Craddock made a note, his expression grim. "I'll bring him in again. But we need more than whispers and shadows. The notebook's our best bet. Those verses keep circling back to a rival or a thief." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the festival green, where the crowd was thinning as the morning readings began. She decided to take a turn about the grounds, her knitting bag swinging gently, her senses alert for the festival's secrets. As she strolled past the bookstalls, she overheard snippets of conversation. A poet lamenting Ashby's loss, a reader speculating about the killer, a volunteer muttering about misplaced schedules. At a stall selling rare editions, she paused, her eyes catching a familiar figure. Clara Henshaw, speaking quietly to a vendor, her face taut with something like worry. Miss Marple approached, her smile as disarming as a village spinster's. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said, her voice gentle, "how trying this must be for you, to lose such a talent, and under such circumstances." Clara's gray eyes flicked to her, a guarded smile forming. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Yes, it's a blow. Leonard was irreplaceable, in his way. But the firm will carry on. We must." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "I understand you were discussing a new poet with Mr. Finch yesterday. A bold move, with Mr. Ashby's star still so bright." Clara's smile tightened, her hands smoothing her dress. "Business never stops, Miss Marple. Roland has potential, though he lacks Leonard's charisma. We were merely exploring possibilities." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. Like Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, who always had an eye for the next big order. But she was careful, very careful, about her choices. I wonder if Mr. Finch was as careful. Clara's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Roland's ambitious. That's no crime." She excused herself, her stride brisk as she moved toward another tent. Miss Marple continued her stroll, pausing at the wine stall, where a young volunteer was arranging bottles. "Such a busy place," she remarked, her tone conversational. "I heard Mr. Finch was here yesterday, asking for a particular wine. Did he seem particular about it?" The volunteer, a lanky youth with a nervous smile, nodded. "Aye, he wanted a specific red, Merlot, I think, said it was for a friend. Seemed in a hurry, though, kept looking over his shoulder." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving this into the pattern. A hurry, she thought, like Mr. Pye when he rushed to hide his ledger. Hurry betrays intent. She thanked the youth and moved on, her gaze sweeping the green until it settled on Roland Finch, who was signing copies of his own slim volume at a nearby stall. His gestures were grand, but his eyes, she noted, darted toward the festival office where Clara had disappeared. Returning to the tea tent, Miss Marple found Raymond waiting, his face alight with fresh gossip. "Aunt Jane, you'll never guess. A waiter saw Finch with a bottle of wine near the office, not the stall. He was handing it to someone, couldn't see who, but it was just before lunch when Clara's scarf went missing." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "How curious," she said softly. Like the time Mr. Hodges' tools were passed to a stranger at the fete, small exchanges can mean so much. She glanced at Craddock, who was approaching with a determined stride. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've got another witness." A bookseller saw Finch near Clara's tent, not the office, right after lunch. He was holding something, maybe a scarf, maybe not. The vendor's not sure, but it's another link. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Mr. Finch is a busy man, Inspector. Wine, scarves, whispers with Mrs. Henshaw. In St. Mary Mead, when young Tommy was seen too often near the orchard, it wasn't apples he was after. It was trouble. I wonder what trouble Mr. Finch was seeking." Craddock grunted, his notebook snapping shut. "I'm bringing him in again, and we'll keep digging into that notebook. If Ashby's verses point to Finch, we'll find the proof." Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind turning over the festival's secrets. The wine, the scarf, the burned letter, the poet's cryptic verses. The green, with its air of cultured ambition, was a stage for hidden passions, and she knew that the truth, like a delicate stitch, was waiting to be pulled free. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, now in the final hours of its third day, seemed to hold its breath as dusk settled over the village green. The tents, their canvas glowing faintly under the strung lanterns, stood like silent sentinels amidst a crowd that had thinned to a determined few. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, mingled with the faint scent of ink and paper from the bookstalls. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her usual table by the tea tent, sipped a cup of chamomile, her gray shawl now complete and folded neatly in her knitting bag. Her eyes, sharp as ever, traced the movements of the festival goers, noting the way their glances lingered on the police tape still encircling Leonard Ashby's tent. Her nephew, Raymond, ever eager for the next twist in the drama, hovered nearby, scribbling notes for what he insisted would be his greatest novel yet. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case teetering on the brink of resolution, had decided to gather the four suspects, Clara Henshaw, Martin Quayle, Evelyn Carter, and Roland Finch, for a final round of questioning. He had chosen the festival's main tent for the occasion, its spacious interior offering room for the suspects to face one another, a tactic he hoped might shake loose the truth. Miss Marple, invited to observe, entered the tent with her characteristic unobtrusiveness, her lavender cardigan blending into the shadows. She settled into a chair near the back, her knitting bag at her feet, though her hands remained still, her attention fixed on the scene unfolding before her. The tent was arranged with a long table at its center, flanked by chairs for the suspects. Craddock stood at one end, his notebook open, his expression one of steely resolve. Constable Harris stood by the entrance, his eyes scanning the group for any sign of unrest. The suspects entered one by one, each carrying their own air of tension. Clara Henshaw, her auburn hair swept into a severe chignon, sat with the poise of a general, her tailored dress immaculate, but her fingers betraying a slight tremor. Martin Quayle, his sharp features set in a sneer, slouched in his chair, his frayed tweed jacket a contrast to his air of intellectual superiority. Evelyn Carter, clutching her worn copy of Wounds of the Muse, looked small and fragile, her eyes red-rimmed but wide with a mix of fear and defiance. Roland Finch, his velvet jacket slightly askew, strode in with a poet's swagger, though his ink-stained fingers twitched nervously. Craddock cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tense, heavy silence. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone formal but edged with authority. "We've gathered evidence over the past 2 days, and it's time to lay it out. One of you knows more about Leonard Ashby's death than you've admitted. Let's start with the facts." He placed a photograph of the rose-embroidered scarf on the table, its delicate pattern stark against the grainy image. "This scarf was used to strangle Mr. Ashby. Mrs. Henshaw, you claim yours was stolen from the festival office. Miss Carter, you say yours was in your bag, and we've confirmed it's clean. Mr. Quayle, you deny any connection to it. Mr. Finch, you were seen near the office when Mrs. Henshaw's scarf went missing. Care to explain?" Finch's lips curled into a half-smile, though his eyes were wary. "I've said it before, Inspector. I was in the office for the poetry contest. I didn't see any scarf, and I certainly didn't take one." Clara's voice was crisp, cutting in before Craddock could respond. "If Roland took it, he's a fool. That scarf was a gift from a colleague, not something I'd leave lying about for anyone to steal." Evelyn's voice trembled as she spoke, her fingers clutching her book. "It wasn't mine. I told you, mine's at my lodgings. I'd never hurt Leonard. Never." Quayle snorted, his sneer deepening. "This is absurd. You're chasing scarves when you should be looking at motives. Ashby was a fraud, and I proved it. If anyone wanted him dead, it was someone he'd crossed, probably Finch with his petty jealousy." Finch's eyes flashed, his voice rising. "Petty? My work will outlast Ashby's drivel. I didn't need to kill him to prove it." Miss Marple, silent in her corner, watched the exchange with keen interest. Like the parish meeting in St. Mary Mead, she thought, when Mr. Pye and Mr. Thomas nearly came to blows over a trivial slight. Accusations reveal as much about the accuser as the accused. Her eyes lingered on Finch's restless hands, the way they clenched as Quayle spoke. Craddock raised a hand, silencing the bickering. "Let's move to the wine. A sedative was found in Mr. Ashby's glass, enough to dull his senses. Mr. Finch, you were seen at the wine stall, asking for a specific bottle of Merlot, the same as in Ashby's tent. You claimed it was for a friend. Who was that friend?" Finch's smile faltered, his fingers twitching. "I don't recall the details. I was helping a volunteer, that's all. Festival duties, you know?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "A volunteer also saw you with a bottle near the office and another near Ashby's tent before his reading. That's a lot of wandering with wine." Mr. Finch, Clara's voice cut in, sharp and cold. "If Roland was carrying wine, it wasn't for me. I don't touch Merlot. It's too heavy for my taste." Evelyn's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard an argument in the tent before the scream. A man's voice saying something about taking what's mine. Could it have been about the wine?" Quayle laughed, a harsh sound. "You're grasping at straws, Inspector. If there was an argument, it was probably Ashby whining about his reviews. I had nothing to do with any wine." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind turning over Evelyn's words. An argument, she thought, like the one Mrs. Bantry overheard at the fete when Mr. Hodge quarreled with his cousin over a debt. Small words, big consequences. Aloud, she said softly, "Inspector, might we revisit Mr. Ashby's notebook? That line about the rival's shadow. It seems to echo Miss Carter's story." Craddock nodded, pulling the notebook from an evidence bag. He opened it to the final page, reading aloud. "The rival's shadow looms, but my light burns brighter." Written just before his death. "Mr. Finch, you've admitted to envying Ashby. This sounds like he was pointing at you." Finch's face flushed, his voice rising. "He mocked me, Inspector, called my work derivative, said I'd never match him. That note proves nothing. Poets write nonsense all the time." Clara's eyes narrowed, her voice low. Leonard was vain, but he wasn't cruel. If he wrote that, he felt threatened, perhaps by someone closer than a rival. Quayle snorted again. Threatened? He was paranoid, thinking everyone was out to steal his glory. That's why he drank himself into a stupor. Evelyn's tears spilled over, her voice breaking. He wasn't drunk. He was kind, always kind. Someone did this to him, someone who hated him. Miss Marple's eyes flicked from one suspect to another, noting the cracks in their facades. Clara's guarded composure, Quayle's biting cynicism, Evelyn's fragile devotion, Finch's bristling pride. Like the village hall, she thought, when everyone accused everyone else of stealing the raffle money. The truth was in the silences, not the shouts. Craddock's voice hardened. The evidence points to a plan, not a spur-of-the-moment act. The sedative in the wine, the stolen scarf, the lack of struggle. It was deliberate. Mr. Finch, you had access to the wine stall, the office, and a motive. You were seen whispering with Mrs. Henshaw, perhaps plotting more than a book deal. Finch's composure snapped, his voice a snarl. Plotting. I was negotiating my future, not Ashby's death. He mocked me, yes, but I'd have beaten him with my words, not a scarf. Clara's voice was icy. If you're accusing me, Inspector, you're mistaken. I had no part in this. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but clear. Mr. Finch, you said Mr. Ashby mocked you. When was this, and what exactly did he say? Finch hesitated, his eyes darting to the others. Before his reading, he said my poems were pale echoes of his, that I'd never be more than a shadow. I lost my temper, told him I'd show him up, but I didn't kill him. Craddock seized the moment, his voice relentless. You drugged his wine, didn't you? Slipped in the sedative, stole Clara's scarf from the office, waited until he was drowsy and strangled him, all to claim his fame. Finch's face drained of color, his hands slamming the table. No, I didn't. Yes, I hated him, but I didn't kill him. I gave him the wine? Yes, but only because he asked for it. I didn't know it was drugged. The tent fell silent, the confession hanging like a storm cloud. Clara's eyes widened, Quayle's sneer froze, and Evelyn gasped, her book slipping to the floor. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her mind racing. Like Mr. Thomas, she thought, admitting he'd sold bad meat, but swearing he meant no harm. Half-truths are the most dangerous kind. Craddock pressed forward, his voice low and intense. You gave him the wine, knowing it would dull him. You took the scarf, used it to strangle him, and left that note. The muse is silent, to make it look poetic. Finch's voice broke, his bravado crumbling. He mocked me. I wanted him humbled, not dead. I got the wine from the stall, yes, but I didn't drug it. I took the scarf, Thought I don't know, embarrass him, leave it in his tent, but I didn't kill him. I went back, saw him alive, then left. When I heard the scream, I was near the oak tree." Craddock's eyes gleamed, but Miss Marple's voice cut through, soft but piercing. "Mr. Finch, you took the scarf to embarrass him? How curious. Like young Tommy, who stole his brother's cricket bat to shame him. But murder, Inspector, requires more than spite." Finch collapsed back in his chair, his voice a whisper. "I swear, I didn't do it. I hated him, but I didn't kill him." Craddock signaled to Harris, who stepped forward. "Roland Finch, you're under arrest for the murder of Leonard Ashby. We'll sort out the details at the station." As Finch was led away, Clara's face remained impassive. Quayle's sneer returned, and Evelyn sobbed quietly. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, her mind still turning. A confession, she thought, but not the whole story. Like Mrs. Bantry's roses, someone else held the shears. She stepped out into the dusk, the festival's lanterns flickering like stars. The truth was close, but a final thread remained, waiting to be pulled. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The St. Mary's Literary Festival, in its final moments, seemed to exhale a weary sigh as the village green emptied under a sky bruised with twilight. The tents, their canvas sagging after days of strain, were being dismantled, their lanterns dimming one by one. The air carried the faint tang of damp grass and the lingering sweetness of spilled wine, a reminder of the revelry now overshadowed by Leonard Ashby's murder. Miss Jane Marple stood near the tea tent, her lavender cardigan buttoned against the evening chill, her completed gray shawl draped over her shoulders. Her knitting bag hung at her side, empty of yarn, but heavy with the weight of her thoughts. Her nephew, Raymond, subdued for once, stood beside her, his notebook tucked away, his usual exuberance tempered by the gravity of Roland Finch's arrest. Inspector Craddock emerged from the main tent, his face etched with a mix of relief and lingering doubt. The arrest of Finch had brought a semblance of closure to the festival, but Miss Marple's quiet presence, her eyes bright with unspoken insights, suggested the case was not as neatly resolved as it seemed. She had remained in the background during the confrontation, her silence a canvas for the suspect's revelations. But now, as the festival wound down, she felt the need to tie up the final threads. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, approaching her with a tired smile, "you were right to keep us looking beyond the obvious. Finch's confession, taking the scarf, handing over the wine, it's enough to hold him, but something tells me you're not entirely satisfied." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile, her eyes scanning the green, where volunteers were folding chairs and stacking books. "Satisfaction, Inspector, is a luxury in cases like this." Mr. Finch's envy was clear, but envy, like young Tommy's spite in St. Mary Mead, often blinds more than it kills. His confession feels incomplete, like a poem missing its final stanza. Craddock nodded, his notebook still clutched in his hand. He admitted to the wine and the scarf, but swears he didn't drug or strangle Ashby. The sedative in the wine, the lack of struggle, it points to him, but there's no direct evidence of the act itself. We're checking his lodgings for any trace of the sedative. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the cordoned-off tent, now being dismantled by constables. "The wine, the scarf, the note, they're all deliberate, Inspector. Like Mrs. Bantry's stolen brooch, placed to mislead. I wonder if Mr. Finch was a tool, not the hand that wielded it." Raymond, unable to stay silent, piped up. "A tool, Aunt Jane? You mean someone set him up? That's positively Machiavellian, like one of my plots, only better." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Life, Raymond, is often more cunning than fiction. Let us walk a little, Inspector. The green may have more to tell us." They strolled across the grass, the festival's remnants scattered like leaves after a storm. Clara Henshaw was near the bookstalls, overseeing the packing of unsold volumes, her face a mask of professional calm. She caught Miss Marple's eye and offered a nod, though her hands betrayed a nervous fidgeting with her portfolio. "Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple called softly, approaching. "You must be relieved to see the festival end, despite its sorrows." Clara's gray eyes met hers, guarded but polite. "Relieved, yes, but it's a loss for us all. Leonard's work was our cornerstone. I've decided to publish his final poems posthumously. It's what he would have wanted." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "A fitting tribute, like Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, who printed a memorial pamphlet for a local poet. But she was careful to choose her words, lest they reveal too much. I trust you'll do the same." Clara's smile tightened, and she excused herself, her stride brisk. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the careful poise that hid a deeper unease. "Ambition," she thought, "is a sturdy shield, but it can crack under pressure." Nearby, Martin Quayle stood alone, scribbling in a notebook, his sneer softened by the day's events. Miss Marple approached, her voice mild. "Mr. Quayle, I hear you're writing a tribute to Mr. Ashby. A change of heart, perhaps?" Quayle's pen paused, his eyes narrowing. "A tribute, yes, but not a whitewash. Ashby had talent, I'll admit, but he was no saint. My piece will be honest, something he rarely was." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had she been knitting, but her hands were still. "Honesty is a sharp tool, Mr. Quayle. Like Mr. Pye's critiques in St. Mary Mead, it can wound deeply. I wonder if your words wounded Mr. Ashby more than you intended." Quayle's sneer returned, but his eyes flickered with something like unease. "He knew my opinion. If it stung, that was his problem." He turned back to his notebook, dismissing her. Miss Marple moved on, her gaze settling on Evelyn Carter, who sat on a bench near the oak tree, her copy of Wounds of the Muse open in her lap, tears staining the pages. Miss Marple sat beside her, her voice soft as a lullaby. "My dear, you loved his words so much. It must be hard to let him go." Evelyn's voice was a whisper, choked with grief. "He saw me, Miss Marple. His poems, they were my heart. I can't believe he's gone, or that Roland would do this." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Love blinds us, my dear, but it also reveals truths, like young Lily in St. Mary Mead, who saw only the curate's kindness and missed his indifference. You heard an argument, you said. Can you recall anything more?" Evelyn's eyes widened, her fingers tightening on the book. It was a man's voice, low, angry. Something about taking what's mine. I thought it was about poetry, but now, I don't know. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the phrase. Like Mr. Hodge's cousin, who quarreled over a shared inheritance. Small words, big stakes. She rose, leaving Evelyn to her tears, and rejoined Craddock near the tea tent. "Anything new?" Craddock asked, his eyes searching her face. "Only fragments, Inspector," she said softly. "But fragments, like the pieces of Mrs. Bantry's broken vase, can be pieced together. Mr. Finch's envy drove him to small acts, stealing a scarf, delivering wine. But murder requires a colder heart. I wonder if we've overlooked someone closer to Mr. Ashby. Craddock's brow furrowed. Closer? We've checked everyone who was near the tent, unless you're suggesting a fifth suspect. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not necessarily, Inspector, but in St. Mary Mead, when the vicar's silver went missing, it wasn't the obvious thief who took it. It was the one who knew its value. Mr. Ashby's value was his fame, his words. Who stood to gain most from their loss? Craddock made a note, his expression thoughtful. Clara gains from his posthumous work. Quayle gains credibility by outliving him. Evelyn, she loses everything. Finch is still our best bet, but I'll keep digging. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the green, where the last of the tents were coming down. The truth, Inspector, is like a poem. It reveals itself in layers. We're close, but we must read carefully. As they parted, Raymond joined her, his face alight with a final piece of gossip. Aunt Jane, a volunteer just told me Clara was seen burning papers in the office last night, after Finch's arrest. Could be nothing, but it's odd, don't you think? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Odd indeed, Raymond. Like Mrs. Eldridge burning her old receipts to hide a debt. Small acts, big secrets. She adjusted her shawl, her mind weaving together the festival's final threads, the scarf, the wine, the verses, and now, Clara's hidden flames. The truth was near, and Miss Marple knew it would soon step into the light. Chapter 12. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The Street Mary's Literary Festival had drawn its final curtain, leaving the village green bare under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. The tents were gone, their canvas folded and carted away, and the bookstalls had vanished, leaving only trampled grass and the faint echo of poetic voices. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the green, her lavender cardigan buttoned against the evening chill, her gray shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders. Her knitting bag, now empty of yarn, hung from her arm, a quiet companion to her reflections. The festival's drama had ended with Roland Finch's arrest, yet Miss Marple's mind lingered on the case, sifting through its threads as she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. Her nephew, Raymond, subdued by the resolution but still brimming with literary aspirations, stood beside her, his suitcase packed for their journey home. Inspector Craddock approached, his face a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "we're wrapping things up here. Finch is in custody, and the evidence, the wine, the scarf, his own admission, should be enough to convict. I owe you a debt, as usual. Your nudge about the notebook and that scarf kept us on the right path." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "You're too kind, Inspector. I merely pointed out a few stitches that needed mending. In St. Mary Mead, when Mrs. Bantry's roses were ruined, it was the smallest clue, a broken twig, that led us to the truth. Here, it was Mr. Ashby's words and Mr. Finch's envy. Raymond, unable to resist, chimed in. "It's like something out of a tragedy, Aunt Jane. A poet undone by his own ambition, strangling his rival to claim the spotlight. I'm already sketching the novel in my head." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Tragedy, Raymond, is often just human weakness dressed in finer words. Mr. Finch wanted fame, but he lacked the patience to earn it. Like young Tommy in St. Mary Mead, who thought stealing his brother's cricket bat would make him a hero. Small sins lead to greater ones. Craddock nodded, his notebook tucked under his arm. "We found traces of the sedative in a vial at Finch's lodgings, hidden in a poetry anthology. He's still claiming he only meant to humiliate Ashby, but the scarf and the wine tell a different story. Clara's confirmed she's publishing Ashby's final poems, and Quayle's tribute is already making waves. Even Evelyn's planning to attend a memorial reading. Miss Marple's gaze softened, drifting to the green where Evelyn Carter had last been seen, clutching her book of Ashby's poems. "Poor child," she murmured. Her devotion was her world, but it blinded her to Mr. Ashby's limits, like Lily in St. Mary Mead, who saw only the curate's kindness. And Mr. Quayle, his pride is soothed now that his rival is gone. As for Mrs. Henshaw, her ambition will carry her forward, though I suspect she'll watch her scarves more closely in future. Craddock chuckled, a rare sound. "You see through them all, don't you?" I checked on that burned paper Clara was seen with. It was just festival receipts, nothing incriminating. Seems she was just tidying up. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained gentle. Tidying, yes, like Mrs. Eldridge burning her old receipts to hide a debt. But sometimes, Inspector, the act of burning is its own confession. Still, Mr. Finch's hands were stained with more than ink, and that's enough for now. Raymond adjusted his suitcase, his voice eager. "Come on, Aunt Jane. The train won't wait. I'm dying to get back and start writing this up. The Strangled Poet. It's got a ring to it, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. "A fine title, Raymond, but real life is rarely so neat. Murder, like poetry, leaves echoes that linger." They made their way to the station, the village receding behind them. On the train, Miss Marple settled by the window, her shawl warm against the draft. The countryside rolled past, its fields and hedgerows a familiar comfort. She thought of the festival, its passion, its rivalries, its secrets. The scarf with its rose embroidery, the wine laced with a sedative, the note proclaiming, "The muse is silent." All were threads in a tapestry of human failing. Roland Finch's envy had driven him to a desperate act, but Miss Marple wondered if other shadows had stirred in the background, unseen. Back in her cottage, she lit the fire and set the kettle on, the familiar rituals soothing her mind. She sat by the hearth, her hands idle for once, and reflected on the case. "Poetry," she mused aloud, "is a dangerous art. It reveals too much of the heart, and the heart, like Mr. Finch's, can be a treacherous thing." A knock at the door announced Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you must tell me everything. A murder at a literary festival. It's too delicious." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. "It's a sad business, Dolly, but not so different from our village. Envy, pride, love, they're the same everywhere, only dressed in finer words." As they sipped tea, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the festival's echoes, the whispered argument Evelyn overheard, Clara's burned papers, Quayle's hidden letter. The case was closed, but like a poem, it left questions unanswered, lines unfinished. She wondered what drama her next visit with Raymond might bring, and her eyes twinkled at the thought. The world, like St. Mary Mead, was never short of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was always ready to unravel them.